Session 2, titled North Korea's Choice, Nuclear Issue, will now begin. Dr. Jung Park, SK Korea Foundation Chair in Korea Studies at the Brookings Institution, will be moderating the session. Dr. Park, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks to everyone for showing up to the night session. As you can tell by the ambiance, this is indeed the night session. I thank you for the introduction, and thanks to Asan for inviting me. I wanted to do quick introductions down this way of our distinguished panel, have some opening remarks by each of the panelists, and then I'd like to have more an interactive discussion today among the panelists and with you in the audience, given that you've given this time to us to talk about North Korea's choice. We'll start down this way. My name is Jung Park. I'm at Brookings Institution. Next to me is Ambassador Chun Yungwoo, who's the chairman and founder of the Korean Peninsula Futures Forum. And he also served as the National Security Advisor to President Lee Myung-bak. To his left is Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. He was also at the CIA with me, but I don't think we ever overlapped, though, Bruce. Next to Bruce is Dr. Nishino, who is a professor at the Department of Political Science and Faculty of Law and Politics at Keio University. Jonathan Pollack is to his left, who is a colleague of mine at Brookings Institution and author of 24 books, including No Exit, which was mentioned earlier today as one of the great books on North Korea's nuclear program. Finally, but not least, is Scott Snyder, who's a senior fellow for Korea Studies and director of the program on U.S.-Korea policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. His book was also mentioned today by Jim Steinberg, I think. Scott has a great book, South Korea at the Crossroads, Autonomy and Alliance in an Era of Rival Powers, that was published last year. Thank you. So when I look at this panel, I did some quick math, and I think we have about 150, 160 years worth of expertise on Asia issues. And as any person who's looked at North Korea issues, talking about North Korea after a few drinks is the best way to go. I wanted to open up with a scene setter. This time last year, Asan was celebrating its 10th plenum. But North Korea had a party plenary last year, right around this time. And this is when Kim Jong-un said that the country no longer needed to have nuclear or ballistic missile testing. That was taken as very good news, and that sparked hopes that Kim had made a strategic choice in favor of engagement and integration. And amid the Inter-Korean summit that happened a few days after, and the US summit that June, there was a lot of hope that, that Kim was going to look at economic development in favor of nuclear weapons. Of course, the other session, the night session tonight, is North Korea's choice economy. You made the choice to come to the nuclear session because we understood that we can't have both. You can't be in two places at once. But for Kim Jong-un, I think he still thinks that he can have both nuclear weapons and the economy. As part of his Pyongyang policy, which he announced in 2013. The idea of choice, or the concept or the framework of choice, continues to resonate. At the Singapore summit, President Trump showed Kim Jong-un a 4-minute video in which the narrator says, 2 leaders, 1 destiny, a story about a special moment in time when a man is presented with 1 chance that may never be repeated. What will he choose? To show vision and leadership or not? And so we have a montage of workers busy at a factory, horses galloping down a beach, industry, business, a thriving economy. The or not was war. President Trump said, I think he loved it. And President Trump, since we've had 2 summits, continues to talk about a brighter future. The question is, will he choose nuclear weapons or the brighter future? But I think what the Hanoi summit and the aftermath and North Korea's actions and statements show is that Kim has refused to make that choice. I know that our panelists here have prepared a couple of some comments. So I want to, with that setup, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to talk maybe 2 to 5 minutes about a couple of key points that you'd like to bring up. And then ultimately, I'd like to open it up for discussion with you all and with the audience. Since it's the night session, I'm going to mix it up a little and start at the end with Scott Snyder, if I may.
Okay, Jung. Well, you did a very nice setup job. I think that we'll probably converge around a consensus supporting your judgment that we may have to make a choice, but Kim Jong-un doesn't. Really, I think that the key thing here related to this session about North Korea's choice is that North Korea is making the wrong choice compared to the video that we've now seen 3 times where South Korea is making the right choice. And that makes the Korean Peninsula a real-life social science experiment about the value of making right choices in life. But what I really want to drill down on as a way of kind of stimulating discussion is what would be the signs that Kim Jong-un is starting to make a right choice? Another way of putting it is, how do we know if Kim Jong-un is willing to operate from a different playbook from that of his father? And that's an interesting and challenging question because, in fact, when we have seen Kim Jong-un's initial foray into international diplomacy in 2018, he really followed his father's template from the year 2000, where he started by reaching out to Beijing, met with the South Korean leader, and then reached out to the United States. But what would be the signals for North Korea that we're actually dealing with a different North Korea? And I'm going to give you 5. And I think the first sign that Kim Jong-un might be operating from a new playbook, you can make your own judgment about whether he's doing so. I'm going to reserve judgment at this time. 1, a North Korea that honors rather than pockets concessions. A North Korea that abandons the guerrilla state mentality. And that is willing to accept quid pro quos as part of the natural interaction among states, and that doesn't place itself at the center and simply collect tribute from the outside world, but actually recognizes that there's a need to reciprocate. A second sign of a North Korean new playbook, in my view, would be that North Korea would abandon the Uri Minjokgiri game. The our nation by itself approach, especially towards South Korea. I guess one way of doing that would be to get rid of Uri Minjokgiri as a publication, a propaganda organ to the outside world, but I don't see that happening right now. A third sign of a new approach would be North Korea stops placing the honor of the supreme dignity as the essential precondition for diplomatic progress. I think we've had evidence to the contrary of that just recently with a response to Secretary Pompeo's description of Kim Jong-un as a tyrant. A fourth sign would be that North Korea adopts a less vertically structured international diplomacy. Actually, it means accepting the idea that you have to do working level diplomacy along with leader-led diplomacy. And I think that a fifth sign of a new playbook would be that North Korea shows diplomatic flexibility and pursues a pragmatic problem-solving approach. We can come back to the end, come back to these at the end and decide whether it's a new playbook or an old playbook, but I just want to put those out as the criteria that we should watch for as we judge Kim Jong-un's ability to recognize that he has to make a choice.
Thank you, Scott. Jonathan?
Thank you, Jung, and thanks very much to the Asan Institute for the invitation to be here. I thought I might make a few comments that put North Korea's interest in nuclear weapons in a larger historical context. We've been asked here to talk about choices, and North Korea's nuclear choice, if we might call it that, has been the preoccupation of 5 American presidents and 7 presidents of the Republic of Korea. Some of these presidents have been on the left, some on the right, some more in the center. All have asked the same question: are there circumstances under which North Korea can be compelled or persuaded to forego its pursuit of nuclear weapons capability? The question has been asked and answered repeatedly, and the answer, to this point at least, has always been an unequivocal no. Now we see President Trump and President Moon trying one more time to convince North Korea somehow that there is a way out, that we are indeed not at a point of, as I've described it, no exit. But this flies in the face of enormous accumulated experience that we have with the North. Somehow, a different nuclear choice presumes an ability to reconfigure the enduring strategic calculus that has sustained North Korea and sustained pursuit of nuclear weapons for more than 50 years. Now, all of this said as background does not mean that North Korea is opposed to periodic discussions, or we might even say negotiations, usually as a tool to advance larger goals. So there is the repeated question of how it reads its adversaries, and the challenge, of course, in a policy sense for us is we want to avoid scenarios where we are negotiating with ourselves. This has been a repeated problem. It's led to strategic miscalculations that have enabled North Korea all too often to evade, to avoid, and to buy time. So, as I look at the bigger picture in the context now of North Korea, if not being a fully arrived nuclear weapons state, much farther along in its goals than would have been the case at an earlier point, I'm very much struck by the fact that North Korea today talks about its capabilities in terms very, very different from where it first began. Jung is giving me a look. Do I have another minute or two? Okay. That if we go back...
You'll know the look.
What's that?
You'll know the look.
Oh, I'll know the look. Yeah, I know. The slit across the room. That in 2010 and 2011, in major statements emanating from the DPRK Foreign Ministry, the argument that was made was, we really don't care what anyone else thinks about this. We're not seeking anyone's approval. We are doing this because it is in our supreme national interest to do so. What you hear now from North Korea is a very, very different argument than that. The argument now is one of seeking recognition, legitimacy, and acceptance of its nuclear weapons capabilities. The argument that's often used, it's the Pakistan model. In other words, a state that is not a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but is in possession of nuclear weapons. And this has come up repeatedly now as North Korea seeks to establish ground that is different from the past, reflecting the extent of the capabilities that they have now demonstrated and acquired over the last number of years. So looking ahead, as I see it, there are 3 ways we can look at North Korea's, if we call it, diplomatic behavior. The first is that there are steps that North Korea is prepared to take, either through its own unilateral actions or through negotiated agreements, provided there is the requisite political and economic compensation with it. That's one level. And North Korea has done this off and on over the years. That's important. The second is where North Korea intimates an interest in particular kinds of discussions or negotiations that, at least in theory, sound like potential off-ramps from its nuclear weapons pursuit, that it depends a lot on the interlocutor they are dealing with. But the problem is that, and this may buy us off a certain amount of pressure, it may lead to pauses, breathing space, if you will, in their nuclear weapons pursuits. This is usually foundered on issues of verification. And then finally, there is unequivocally what I would call the no-go zone, the treasured sword. What North Korea is not prepared, under any circumstance that I can discern, to forego. So even if we look at what was supposedly under discussion in Hanoi, the discussions were about closing various kinds of facilities at Yungwoo and so forth. There was no discussion, none that I'm aware of, that talked about letting go of any nuclear weapons. And that's precisely the point, that North Korea believes or argues that, or Kim Jong-un argues that, if it were not for the capabilities that it has demonstrated, the United States would not be negotiating or attempting to negotiate with it today. And there's a logic to that. I get that. But it is the treasured sword, and it's the things that you simply are not giving up under any circumstances. And that's where we find ourselves today. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Nishino?
Okay. So thank you, moderator. Thank you. I'd like to express my thanks to Asan Institute to invite me this great occasion. So I'd like to make a couple of points by interpreting the Kim Jong-un's recent remarks by in the People's Supreme Assembly. Number one, so clearly, as moderator mentioned, he's still prioritize economic development of North Korea. But interestingly, he didn't mention his 5-year economic strategy in his speech. So this suggests that he needed to modify or revise his economic plan because of the failure of the second summit meeting between Trump and Kim in Hanoi. So number two, still he stick to the top-down approach with President Trump and to set a new relationship with the United States by negotiating with President Trump. And he thinks he may easily induce compromise from the President Trump. So number three, interestingly, his last words in his speech in the Supreme People's Assembly, he said he is not stick to lifting sanction. It's not easy to interpret this kind of the Kim Jong-un's word, but I would say he may be prepared for making concession to continue the dialogue with President Trump. And obviously, he wants to have another summit meeting with President Trump. So to realize the third summit meeting with President Trump, Kim Jong-un, I think, may make a compromise in dealing with the United States. So number four, in his New Year address, he said he wants to activate multilateral dialogue, which transfer armistice status into a peace treaty. So now I think now is the time for Kim Jong-un to establish this kind of multilateral dialogue, such as six-party talks, because he can make the 2 and 4, so 2 means the United States and Japan, which are sticking to the strong economic sanction on North Korea. But another 4, I think the China, Russia, South Korea, and North Korea, which try to continue the kind of the dual track approach or phased approach. So now is the time for Kim Jong-un to establish this kind of the multilateral dialogue. And finally, I will say that yes, in my observation, Kim Jong-un is obviously stick to the bilateral interaction with President Trump, but at the same time, now he needs to the hedging strategy by fostering the making diversification, not only with China, but also Russia to hold a summit meeting. So we need to prepare to this kind of North Korea's very various approach. What's Japan's choice then? Our choice is clear. Number one, first of all, actually now there's been a growing pessimism about denuclearization of the North Korea. But I will say that we cannot abandon pursuing denuclearization of North Korea. And we cannot abandon peaceful manner of realizing denuclearization. This is Japan's basic position. So then Japan's choice, number one, we needed to continue the sustain strong economic pressure on North Korea. And number two, at this point, clearly, we, Japan and the United States, needed to enhance defense and deterrence capability vis-a-vis North Korea's continuing nuclear program. But at the same time, number three, Japan needs to directly talk with North Korea. So as you may know, Prime Minister Abe, since last autumn, clearly mentioned repeatedly that he is prepared to reopen the direct talk with Kim Jong-un. But this summit meeting between Abe and Kim should contribute to the progress of the abduction issue. If North Korea shows sincere attitude, more sincere attitude about abduction issue, we Japanese government can foster and establish our bilateral tie with North Korea, as well as giving economic assistance. So now is the time for also the Prime Minister Abe to make Kim Jong-un right choice to have a direct dialogue with Japan. Thank you.
Thank you. Bruce Klingner?
I not only want to thank Asan for the invitation, but I want to commend the audience for having so many of you stay up so late to go to this panel. Jung and I were talking earlier, afraid we'd only get 2 or 3 people, and so sort of knowing that the audience is jet lagged and slightly drunk, which is fine because so's the panel. We really had, although the conference theme is Korea's choice, really we also had a panel's choice, in that we could either raise the bar in being not only brilliant but entertaining in order to keep you awake, or had only a few of you shown up, we would have just canceled it and just gone to the bar. So we now, because we have really a full audience, we I guess have to postpone our drinking. One of the things that I found striking from the Hanoi summit is I will admit I was surprised by the outcome. It seemed all the indications were that we were going to go for what became known as a small deal. Now, it turns out, sort of below the surface, the U.S. policy was already becoming firmer, given frustration with North Korea's intransigence. But right now, we have a tougher U.S. policy than we did before the summit, although in briefings from U.S. officials, all of them will very strongly deny that the policy has changed. And the briefings, to be frank, have been quite confusing and contradictory from the U.S. officials. So what I thought I'd do is point out, say, the 6 things we learned or we took away from the Hanoi summit. The first is that sanctions are working. Clearly, it's what brought North Korea to the table. And all of the other issues that both North and South Korea have been pushing as important, a peace declaration, liaison offices, reducing tensions, improving relations, are all really peripheral issues. It's not what North Korea is interested in. We need to keep that in mind. The second would be North Korea doesn't want to denuclearize. For all the hype about Kim Jong-un being different, he's using the same game plan as his father and his grandfather. He's trying to offer Yongbyon for the 5th time in a negotiation agreement. We've tried 8 deals with North Korea, all failed. We've tried incremental denuclearization, that failed. We tried now a big deal denuclearization, that failed. So it really calls into question the idea that North Korea is just looking, for the right Rubik's Cube combination of benefits to be offered to them to then offer up their arsenal. The third was that canceling the military exercises has not been part of the diplomacy. It was a unilateral decision by President Trump last year, much to the surprise of the Secretary of Defense, the Department of Defense, U.S. Forces Korea, South Korea, and Japan. It was never discussed with Kim Jong-un, as President Trump has said, and we didn't get anything in return for it. And it really is based on President Trump's negative views of alliances and stationing U.S. forces overseas and seeing the cost of military exercises, or indeed sort of the transactional nature or the transactional view of alliances and our forces overseas. Clearly, North Korea has not reciprocated, as General Abrams recently testified, as they have not decreased the size, scope, or intensity of their own training. And they just recently completed their annual their annual winter training cycle with 1 million troops involved. I guess the fourth takeaway would be that U.S. and South Korean claims of North Korean denuclearization were inflated and false. We frequently heard President Moon and Secretary Pompeo saying, as Chairman Kim agreed to the UN definition of denuclearization, as Chairman Kim agreed to CVID, as Chairman Kim agreed to, and we found that certainly was not the case. Because in a way, what the U.S. was doing in Hanoi was simply trying to put down on paper what Kim had already supposedly already agreed to, which we see is now not correct. The fifth takeaway is that the top-down approach has been no more effective than the more traditional bottom-up approach. It certainly shook things up. It certainly put to the test the hypothesis that if only the U.S. leader would meet with the North Korean leader, we would break the logjam of the last 25 years. So we've tested that hypothesis and found it to be false. So we all hope that it may eventually lead to success, but so far it hasn't been any more effective. The sixth takeaway would be that personalizing the foreign policy with North Korea, as President Trump has done, has not only been no more effective, it's been counterproductive. As I mentioned, we've had the military exercises canceled, which we now have at least 11 exercises which have been canceled, as well as constraints put on the other exercises which were carried out. I would disagree with the panel earlier today where they said there's been no degradation in capabilities. I simply don't see how that can be true. If we've curtailed the training, that the readiness has gone down. You can't have a football team, with the linemen training in one stadium, the quarterback training in another stadium, and the running backs training in a third stadium, and just saying, oh, they'll all come together on game day and be just as effective as before. Also on sanctions. As President Trump said a year ago, he's not sanctioning 300 North Korean entities. Those would be 300 entities violating U.S. law for which we have evidence. But we're not sanctioning them because we're talking so nicely with North Korea. Recently, when the Treasury Department tried to timidly sanction 2 more entities, these Chinese shipping companies, the president reversed it or tried to curtail it, which had not been done by previous presidents. And that was, as the White House spokesperson said, because Trump likes Kim. We've also had a holding back on North Korean human rights criticism, whereas the president had given 3 very strong, very moving speeches, including before the National Assembly. Since Singapore, he has not pointed out North Korea's human rights violations. We've had the incident with Otto Warmbier's parents now criticizing the president, where he had held up Otto as a symbol of North Korean human rights violations. Vice President Pence was to give a speech on International Human Rights Day criticizing human rights in North Korea. That was canceled. The U.S. did sanction 3 entities for human rights violations or censorship activities that day. The list was supposed to be longer but was curtailed by the White House. So what we have right now is the president is undercutting the maximum pressure policy, which was never maximum, as he showed by not sanctioning the 300 entities. So just briefly looking forward, if we have a third summit with North Korea, we're not sure which President Trump will show up. Will it be the Singapore Trump, who is willing to make a lot of concessions, really getting nothing in return, or will it be the Hanoi Trump, who is willing to walk away from a bad deal? And finally, although there's much to criticize in the Trump administration's policy towards North Korea, really what we need to keep in mind is that it's North Korea that has been the reason for the impasse for the last 25 years of negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Chun.
Yeah, I think we have too many pessimists in the panel. So for the sake of balance, I would like to play the role of a progressive, Korean.
It is the night session after all.
Yeah, yeah. We won't tell anyone about this.
So, unless you believe in a solution, especially those negotiators, if they don't have a faith in the solution, there will be no solution. So, whether you believe it or not, you should try to believe in a solution and to be optimist. And I think that's very important. And yeah, I have no doubt that Kim Jong-un wants both nuclear arsenal and economic development. But the fact that he came out to the summit, he switched to strategy of engagement with the U.S. means that he realizes that, although that's his ambition, having both nuclear arsenal and economic development are, beyond reach. Otherwise, he has no reason to come out to negotiations. So I wouldn't mind, giving the benefit of doubt to, for now, benefit of doubt to his commitment to denuclearization. And I think we have opportunities to test his real intentions. So we don't have to. If you conclude that North Korea will never denuclearize under any circumstances, that could lead to the conclusion that we should be content with just capping North Korean nuclear capabilities. That will never bring us any solution. So we have to change North Korea's structure of interests to favor denuclearization. So, if I try to give the benefit of doubt to Kim Jong-un's commitment to denuclearization, I'm not smiling because I don't believe it. But he may realize that nuclear arsenal can resolve North Korea's security problems. But it's not going to be a panacea, or it's not going to be enough to resolve all the existential problems that North Korea faces. So, he may believe that there is no future. If you read carefully all his statements to the party Congress, to all the Central Committee plenums, we can detect how much value he attaches to economic development. He seems to believe that there is no future for North Korea, for his regime, in the long term, without economic development. And now that U.S. has raised, or is able to raise the cost of nuclear armament to the point of denying his economic dream, and even to erode chances of long-term viability of the North Korean regime, he may feel the need to make deal with the U.S. on nuclear front. And there's not going to be any chance to jumpstart North Korean economy and become a more prosperous economy without a deal with the U.S. on the nuclear front. So he may believe, I would not rule out the possibility that he could believe that depending on how painful the sanctions turn out to be, maybe denuclearization or rather a pretense of denuclearization could be a better way of ensuring regime survival in the long run. I think he's smart enough to think about that. But what kind of denuclearization? I think we have ample opportunities to test. We can test when we press him to come up with his own definition, operational definition of denuclearization, what he means, what kind of steps he has in mind until the end of denuclearization. And he cannot just hide that indefinitely. And how far he can go. So I think there's ample opportunity. So I wouldn't agree with those who are convinced that North Korea will not denuclearize under any circumstances. But I think it's about terms of conditions for denuclearization. And we cannot just jump to a conclusion from what happened in Hanoi that North Korea has clearly shown that they have no intention to denuclearize. He may have different terms and conditions. He wants to denuclearize maybe on his terms and conditions that would not be consistent with Trump's or any other countries. So what he wants would be a substitute, a credible substitute for nuclear arsenal in the form of a security guarantee, a peace treaty, whatever. It cannot be as good as the in-kind insurance policy in the form of nuclear arsenal. But when you add nuclear latency that North Korea will retain, or residual nuclear capability North Korea will retain at the end of denuclearization, and all the economic benefits, the sanctions relief, all those things, he will all combine them all and see if this is better than nuclear arsenal or not. So I think there is we have to see, and he wants to front load. He wants to cash in all those benefits before he embarks on real denuclearization. That's a problem, and that may not be acceptable to the U.S. or any other countries. So the terms and conditions that he wants to get may be too ambitious for us to come to terms with. We do not know, but from all indications that from his statements, denuclearization he talks about looks more like a mutual nuclear disarmament. Thus far, what he has, if you judge from what he said, it's not a denuclearization as we understand it. It's just a progressive, mutual denuclearization that involves the end of U.S. nuclear umbrella to the Republic of Korea, or deployment of strategic assets in areas that can target North Korea. So when Kim Jong-un talks about denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, of course it's different from FFVD or CVID. It's different. But what is important is whether this denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, that includes the end of nuclear umbrella, includes denuclearization of North Korea, CVID or FFVD, whatever you call it. So if North Korea includes that notion in denuclearization, I don't see much problem with entire denuclearization of entire Korean Peninsula. I don't think we need U.S. nuclear umbrella just to deal with North Korean conventional threats. We have to be ready to give up on extended nuclear deterrence if North Korea is really denuclearized as we understand it. When North Korea, if North Korea really feels compelled to move toward denuclearization, I have no doubt that they will make sure that they will retain the capabilities to rebuild their nuclear arsenal in the shortest period of time. If they can succeed in concealing significant amount of fissile material or a clandestine enrichment plant, what that means is that they can rebuild, even if they honestly dismantle all warheads and missiles. What that means is that they can rebuild their nuclear arsenal in a matter of weeks. If they destroy everything honestly, with perfect verification, opening up everything, it will take about 1 year to rebuild their nuclear arsenal. So I don't think they are ready to retreat 1 year from operational nuclear arsenal. But maybe a matter of weeks or months. So that's still better than allowing them to keep nuclear arsenal as they do. And lastly, I think they, whatever Kim Jong-un said to the Supreme People's Congress or Politburo, I think this is part of the posturing game. And at the end of the day, I think he will come back to dialogue, and he doesn't want resumption of U.S. ROK joint military exercises or the return of military option from the U.S. So in due time, when all the bad air created in Hanoi disappears, and when he, I think in due time he will come back to the dialogue. Let me stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. So far, we have 5 points from Scott, 3 points from Jonathan, 5 points from Dr. Nishino, and 6 points from Bruce.
Too many points.
And many wonderful points from Ambassador Chun. I wanted to ask a couple of questions as the moderator's prerogative to. There's a key assumption in this question of North Korea's choice. And the idea of choice means that there's agency, that there's freedom of action, that there is a series of options or a collection of options or multiple choice, as you will. Can Kim give up nuclear weapons? Is that a choice? Or is that something that North Korea is bound by its own ideology, its own history, its culture, its rhetoric, and its neighborhood?
Which order?
No order.
No order.
Anyone?
I would just say that whether he has decided to give it up or not, I mean, North Korea has signed its name to 8 agreements saying they promised 4 times never to build it, and then 4 times to give up what they promised never to build. And they are required under 11 UN resolutions to give up the nuclear weapons, the missiles, and the BCW. So it's whether they're ever going to do it or not. I mean, I still kind of work on the idea that we can try to change their mind, but in the meantime, there's a penalty for a country that violates UN resolutions, that violates U.S. law and all that. So it's sort of until they carry through with their previous promises or what they're required to do, then they will face penalties in the sense of UN sanctions, U.S. sanctions, and then just lost opportunities of economic engagement from South Korea or international financial institutions. So, we hope they make that choice, but in the meantime, there's the penalties that they face for not making that choice.
I think it's important also to and responding to our progressive statement here, is that you can have, from a North Korean perspective, you can have engagement of all kinds. It does not necessarily correlate with your foregoing the capabilities that you have. I mean, it's a tool in your highly cumulative experience in how you negotiate with the outside world. How you try to segment your strategies with different actors without having to take the definitive step, which would be observable unambiguous, that would actually be to forego capabilities that are already in North Korea's possession. I think of it as kind of like a bank account. They've got these assets that they have. Again, maybe I'm obtuse, maybe I'm just not seeing it, but can anyone ever point to an unambiguous statement, and by this I do not mean Kim Jong-un's declarations of firm will to denuclearize. In North Korean terminology, sure, that's what he means. What does he mean? If the outside world does all these wonderful things for North Korea, we build trust and all that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then maybe we will give up our capabilities. And it's that very fact that understandably for the United States, and I think for others, we have a very technical definition of denuclearization. It's the idea that these capabilities go away verifiably, that the means for production of additional nuclear weapons are eliminated by some particular means and so forth. This is not what North Korea has ever emphasized. What they emphasize is all those other good things have to come first. Good things from the point of view of North Korea, and then we can go down that path. Now, maybe you could just simply, that's a negotiating ploy, but you know, if it were not for the fact that we have been at this for close to 30 years, and the experience is consistent, in my view, then that's what leads my abiding skepticism that we are at some kind of a breakthrough point. Now, let us recognize, and we're not here to discuss, although we have discussed already, specifically the views of a very unconventional American president and a South Korean president who was enormously enamored of breakthroughs of one kind or another with North Korea. So it may well be that given President Trump's unpredictability, even though he seemed to approach things differently in Hanoi, that doesn't mean that he might not settle for a different kind of a deal in the future if it's important enough to him. In fact, it's interesting to note Kim Jong-un's comments in his Supreme People's Assembly speech. What did he do? He differentiated South Korea and the United States. From South Korea, he made very, very clear, look, what you've got to do is wean yourself from this dependence on the Americans. And as for the Americans, you've got to do the right thing and make an offer to us that will meet our expectations that we have outlined. And he even put a deadline on it. Not on South Korea, but a deadline on the United States. What's Kim's calculus? Kim's calculus may be that President Trump needs some kind of a singular achievement with North Korea for his re-election campaign. That may be overstating the importance of it, but it could be a factor. He's fishing. He's looking for formulas of one kind or another, seeing if you can, in the process, induce outside actors to come to a different kind of policy calculation that would leave intact an appreciable portion of what it already possesses. That's the most, quote-unquote, optimistic rendering I can give.
I want to start opening it up to the audience. I'll take 3 questions at a time. Please introduce yourself and ask a question, please. 1, 2, 3. Up front, up here, microphone.
Thank you very much. Ichiro Fujisaki. I'm from a Japanese think tank. It's more of a comment, I'm sorry, but very short one. I think a lot of us are trying very hard to find something new from Kim Jong-un or North Korea, reading their declaration, statements, very hard to try to find. But in reality, it looks like they're not really cornered enough to make any new move. And so from that point, I I'm close to what Mr. Klingner said. However, Dr. Klingner, the difference is that I thought Singapore was not bad because it was able to put North Korea into a cage where they can't do any nuclear experiments anymore. The best thing that happened in Hanoi was that they didn't agree on third top summit, and so that they have abundant time to negotiate at the official level. I'm sorry that this is not a question, but I wanted to make the statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. Gordon.
Thank you. Gordon Flake from the Perth U.S. Asia Center. Since this is a late night panel, I wonder if I could ask the panel to engage in the dark art of prognostication. Right? So, relative consensus, what next? How do things play out? So on the one hand, we're not at the situation we were in late 2017 where we're on the cusp of conflict, where it seemed the U.S. was actively goading the North Koreans into action. So the old jaw is better than war. But it seems that we could very quickly be back in that scenario, no longer having a diplomatic option, particularly if there's a change in Washington, D.C. So what's next? Give us a sense for how you see things actually playing out.
Thanks, Gordon. Next, white shirt over here.
Hi, Anthony Kuhn with NPR. I'd like to ask for your insights and opinions about something you referred to, the hardening of opinion on the U.S. side ahead of the Hanoi summit, which basically ruled out a smaller deal. Who do you think is behind it? How did it happen? And does the U.S. official contention that this is now a consensus within the government hold, or could it change? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a few questions. Is this something new? Is there continuity or change? What's next? Are we back? Is there the potential for back to fire and fury? And what accounts for, I think, Bruce, you said it, there's a hardening of the U.S. position on small deal versus big deal. Can we start with Ambassador Chun and then move down this way? You can please answer whatever question that you think is appropriate from your perspective.
What next? Well, I think North Korea cannot come back with a position it took in Hanoi. I think it was, a bet, a little bit too ambitious. But we must keep in mind that North Korea hasn't lost anything. It was, I think, a rational decision, rational choice for North Korea. Because if you're not to lose any of your bet money, why don't you bet high? If there's a 5% chance to win, you have to bet high. And even if Kim Jong-un didn't believe that he could market his position to Trump, if he believes there is a 5% chance, or even 1% chance, he hasn't lost any of his negotiating assets. He has all those key assets intact. And he has the option of using them for more realistic deal, I would say. Make it a small deal, but more attractive, more palatable to the U.S. Why not? And U.S., even though it took a maximalist position, I think it was wise to take such a maximalist position in response to North Korea's totally unrealistic position. But I think, depending on how willing North Korea is to, come up with a more reasonable position, I think the U.S. position can change. I don't think one-shot deal is possible. Well, it would be best, but not really a feasible thing in the short term. So I wouldn't say that small deal is bad, big deal is good. Big is good, small is bad. No. The reason why the small deal that North Korea proposed was bad was because it's a deal that allows North Korea, a small deal that allows North Korea to keep building up its nuclear arsenal. Even if it was a small deal, it was one that could hold all fissile material production in Yongbyon and outside Yongbyon. And if it just demanded a little bit less than full, virtually all lifting of all sanctions since 2016, I think it would have been far more difficult for Trump to reject the deal. So a small deal separate from the big picture, without giving a big picture, is one thing. A small deal as a first step in the context of a big picture is totally different thing. So if you are sure that this small deal, imperfect as it may be, can seamlessly lead into next small deals that will reduce North Korea's capabilities, why not? But the deal that was on offer was not only to allow North Korea to expand its nuclear arsenal, keep producing fissile material outside Yongbyon, but also would make it more difficult to dismantle the rest of the North Korean programs later, because this is also a less for more deal, giving up dispensable for North Korea in return for indispensable for the U.S. So this is not going to work. But a small deal in itself shouldn't be considered as a bad,
Bruce.
When Gordon asked sort of what next, it reminded me a journalist asked, are we on the brink of a typhoon? And I thought, well, it's kind of like we're in a boat. The sea is calm. The sky is cloudy. We're not going anywhere, but we're just sitting there, and it's nice and calm. Now, it's better than 2 years ago when the seas were really rough and we were talking about preventive attack. It's not as good as a year ago when there was sunshine and we thought we might have deals. Now, what's going to happen tomorrow? We could have a typhoon again, or we could have sunny skies again. I think, now what does that mean in the real world? I think for a while we're going to have sort of this status quo where we're in negotiations, sort of yes, no, and it's sort of, as long as we feel like we're in negotiations, we just sort of keep dragging out the time. For President Trump, he seems to indicate that as long as they're not testing, he's happy. So that may be the metric. As long as they don't test, and as long as we feel or we can claim we're in negotiations, then we just kind of stay with this status quo. And that can get extended every time North Korea says something nice or agrees to a meeting. Well, then you add 2 or 3 months to the timeline of things getting bad again. So I think we'll continue to be in this sort of uncertain status quo for some time. Kim has said his patience may run out at the end of the year. We'll see. If North Korea does a test, then I think we are in a very tense, unpredictable condition. But I think for now, we're in this uncertain status quo. And I think neither side is going to do something drastic very quickly. I think there's going to be a very slow signaling of, I'm starting to get unhappy, I may do something, please do something to prevent me from going down that path. So I think that's the way we are, or where we are for now. On the toughening of U.S. policy, some depict it as kind of on a personal basis, like Mr. Bolton came out of the closet and threw Mr. Pompeo in a car trunk, and now he has control. What we understand from talking to U.S. and foreign officials is that the sort of overall the U.S. policy was toughening, if you want to call it that, in the run-up to even before Hanoi, because there was growing frustration with North Korea. The North Korean counterpart to Mr. Began was only authorized to talk about everything but denuclearization. And that it was similar to the situation in 2000 where, you must talk to the leader to have any kind of deal. Well, what about this? Well, you must talk to the leader. And then when Kim Jong-un came in with the same deal that Began had told his counterpart was not viable, I think the U.S. was like, look, you didn't bring in anything more. We hoped by having a leadership level, you would be willing to wheel and deal. You'll have learned that we weren't going to take this bad deal. So I think it was growing U.S. frustration. Now, the executive branch is not the only player in Washington. Congress is also a player. And on a very bipartisan basis, Congress is very wary of North Korea, also thinks South Korea is trying to offer too much too soon. So you have Republicans and Democrats very unanimous in their viewpoint of the need to maintain or increase pressure on North Korea. 2 big sanctions laws passed by Congress in 2016 and 2017 really didn't give new authority to the executive branch. It was trying to force the executive branch, both Obama and Trump, to use the powers they already had because they felt they weren't enforcing U.S. law. And one thing on the small deal, big deal, I think the names are not right. It was a bad deal, that when North Korea was trying to offer small but get big, trying to get massive economic relief in return for offering up Yongbyon yet again. It was just a bad deal. It was an unbalanced deal. Now, a big deal isn't necessarily inconsistent with incremental implementation. But I think what the U.S. is looking for now is we need an endpoint. We need North Korea to agree to the UN definition of denuclearization. We need North Korea to agree in principle to abandoning its arsenals. And then we can argue about what benefits do they get for which step along the way. But if they're not willing to agree on the endpoint, then we just figure we'll never get to where we want to go.
Thank you.
So regarding what's next, I would say that North Korea will not conduct any serious provocation in this year to legalize a summit meeting with President Trump. And so regarding the denuclearization process, at this point, I'm a bit pessimistic, but yes, Kim's intention is really important, but at the same time, I would say that what kind of security guarantees we can give to North Korea is also important. So in my view, the denuclearization of North Korea is dependent on the strategic interaction between the DPRK and the international community, especially the United States. So in this context, yes, clearly the North Korea's intention and the bold measure for denuclearization is quite important, but at the same time, the measures for security guarantees to North Korea is also important. And what's new about Kim Jong-un regime? I would say substantially, I don't see any something new at this point, but I would say that clearly the style is quite new. He ended the military first policy during his first period, and he tried to realize so-called the North Korean style normal state. And he held successfully the Seventh Party Congress, and now he revised his constitution, the Supreme Assembly's meeting. So the style is quite new, and sometimes styles make a difference. So I would say that Kim Jong-un's new negotiation style and Kim Jong-un's new ruling style may make a difference in the interacting with the international community. Thank you.
I would be looking not so much about negotiating tactics and more other issues that loom. Specifically, what are our judgments about how much North Korea is hurting economically? The sanctions are an imperfect instrument, but they impose costs, significant costs. And if the estimates from the Bank of Korea and others are remotely accurate, you cannot sustain an economy over a longer period of time with the kind of contraction that has been observable over the last several years. Now, this is where it's interesting. Kim Jong-un makes a contradictory argument. All of what we are hearing from the North right now is claims that they are now doing a self-reliant strategy. Now, that's their definition of self-reliance. At the same time, he complains about the sanctions. If you're doing self-reliance, why complain about the sanctions? I mean, it doesn't quite compute. But I think here, the other factor I look at, the independent variables are the President of the Republic of Korea, and even more important, the President of the United States. Kim, I think, anticipated in Hanoi an outcome not dissimilar from what he got in Singapore. Singapore was a meeting. He knew that there were stresses and expectations. After all, Kim Jong-chol had been in the White House. That although we don't know what the content of those discussions were, but that in some sense the back and forth suggested that there was a growing awareness in Washington that the incredible, the minimalist outcomes from Singapore, if I could call it, that's as polite as I'm prepared to describe it, really required a clarity in the discussion between the two top figures. And I think this sobered Kim, but he still probably believes at some level that this is important enough to Donald Trump that he can still pull a rabbit out of a hat if there is a third summit. That would be an educated guess on my part, of course, because we don't know if there's going to be a third summit. We didn't even know there was going to be a first summit until Trump decided it was a good deal, and then we did Hanoi. I mean, this is not the way you craft, frankly, a coherent policy, but that's where we are, and as Mr. Trump likes to remind us, I'm president and you're not. And so you can ask, to what extent is he so invested in this breakthrough, doing something that no president has done before, that he's willing to keep this ball in play. This may be, by the way, apropos of Anthony Kuhn's question, relevant. I don't think that there were any, the presumption of a lot of arguments that's being made is that there were bad guys behind the scenes who fouled it all up somehow in Hanoi. And the North Koreans have so identified two bad guys. They say they don't want to negotiate with Bolton and they don't want to negotiate with Pompeo, which kind of limits your options a little. But I really think it was the very fact that although a lot of us looked at Hanoi with a measure of unease about the possible outcome, it actually had a kind of a salutary effect. It had a clarifying moment when the United States put its cards on the table about its expectations, not to say those were non-negotiable, but they were something that was well beyond what had been discussed in Singapore, and it kind of clarified things to an extent, and that's where we find ourselves.
I think on the hard or soft question, if President Trump has been consistent about anything, it's that there's no sanctions removal or lifting
Correct.
without denuclearization.
Right, yeah.
He's been all over the place on everything else, but on that one talking point, he's been remarkably consistent. Scott.
I think that in order to debate differences within the administration, you have to ask yourself whether Hanoi was a missed opportunity. And I don't think it was a missed opportunity because I don't think that the North Koreans offered complete denuclearization. I think they offered partial denuclearization in the name of complete denuclearization. And so, that is the first issue to be addressed, actually. And so it actually means that North Korea is the side from which concessions are required. Kim Jong-un's speech. So what has Kim Jong-un done post-Hanoi? I mean, his biggest problem coming out of Hanoi is that he looked weak. He failed. And so what has he done in order to remedy that? He signaled possible return to provocations. He is signaling the availability of diplomatic alternatives with Putin. And he used his speech before the Supreme People's Assembly to reframe his position as one of coming from a position of strength by potentially redefining the terms of engagement, saying sanctions may not matter so much to him, by actually hinting at a possible way back to some kind of working level talks, and by proposing a deadline, suggesting that he's in charge. And so I would say that we are at a point where there is an opportunity for further exploration, but we still haven't reached a point where the North Koreans have put enough on the table for their critique of Pompeo and Bolton to be credible. And I just want to go back and say one thing about, does he have a choice? Well, the bar is high because the nuclear program became a source of domestic legitimation in 2013 and 2014. And that means he has to find and get from the United States a better alternative source of domestic legitimation. And the only way to do that is really to actually achieve guarantees of prosperity that put him on a track towards performance legitimacy rather than relying on who has the device that makes the biggest bang.
Thank you. I'll take 3 more questions here. Leaf, and then woman up front. Right here. Gentleman in the front.
Yes. The idea of a big deal of Trump administration has come under very big criticism, but I myself favor a big deal. There's nothing wrong with asking for complete denuclearization, even adding abandonment of other kinds of weapons of mass destruction. But the question is, for North Korea to do so, they need to have a firm security assurance, because that's the reason why they obtained the nuclear weapons, and the regime guarantee. And that goes beyond just a simple piece of paper saying U.S. is not going to attack North Korea. They need to have a substantive backing up of that commitment, which includes in their arguments withdrawal of American troops from South Korea, abandonment of U.S.-Korea alliance, abandonment of U.S. nuclear umbrella over South Korea, because they are giving up their nuclear umbrella themselves. I think it's not illogical for them to ask for it. Let me ask Chun Yungwoo, is South Korea prepared to accept those conditions? And also, let me ask Bruce, is Washington thinking about this kind of return when they asked for a big deal?
Thank you. Leaf.
Thank you very much, late night panel. Leif Erik Easley, Ewha Wons University here in Seoul. Let me know if you disagree, but I got a sense from the bullet points of our distinguished colleagues that if I had to perform a rank ordering of what North Korea values, it would go something like this: humanitarian assistance, less than liaison offices, less than peace declaration, less than sanctions relief, less than their nukes, finally, less than the honor of the Kim leadership. And my question is, if the status of the Kim regime is perhaps the only thing more valuable than their nukes, why don't we go after that? We've given Kim Jong-un a huge status boost with all these summits. And they seem to be very sensitive to the legitimacy of the regime. And by asking this, I'm not suggesting a full delegitimization effort for regime change, no. But ratcheting up some pressure on their regime legitimacy to the point where Kim Jong-un says, uh-oh, I guess I got to go back to talks and maybe present some concrete steps to denuclearization. Thank you.
Thank you. Up front. White shirt.
Yeah, thank you for this session. So my name is Michelle. I'm from Ewha Women's University. So recently, North Korea is allegedly using cryptocurrency to fund its nuclear weapons and resources. And how will it affect the sanctions that's imposed on North Korea from the United Nations and the US? And will cryptocurrency become a big issue in relations to the problem? Thank you.
Thank you. So we have 3 excellent questions. Is South Korea and Washington talking about what if, right? Are we prepared to withdraw troops in the event of? What's the impact on extended deterrence if North Korea gives up its nuclear weapons? Secondly, why not ratchet up pressure on Kim's legitimacy and honor? And finally, what is the cryptocurrency? What's the role of cryptocurrency in North Korea's strategies or tactics, and what needs to be done with that? I'll just take anybody who wants to answer whichever question.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'll answer Mr. Abe's question on, whether the ROK can accept all those things that North Korea would demand as part of the denuclearization. Yeah. Well, security assurance, peace treaty, normalization of relations, all those things. Well, sanctions relief can come before the end of denuclearization. I think it could be phased easing. When we start that process is question. I think when the North Korea begins to, or U.S. begins to ship out fissile material, arsenal, maybe that would be the time to ease sanctions, maybe. Or when you have a total freeze on fissile material production, then U.S. can begin with easier symbolic sanctions relief. But security assurance, peace treaty, all these things, at least the entry into force of security assurance or peace treaty, they cannot come before the end of verified denuclearization. If there is a single nuclear warhead still left in North Korea, if there is a significant amount of fissile material left in North Korea or any fissile material producing facility in North Korea, I don't think they can be negotiated in advance. They can be initialed before the end of denuclearization, but the entry into force cannot come before the verification, the verified denuclearization. So when that comes, what North Korea demands, one thing very clear in their definition of denuclearization is that it includes the end of extended nuclear deterrence. Their position on the withdrawal of U.S. troops or this dismantlement of alliance is not very clear. The peace treaty would put an end to the UN command. Yes, UN command will disappear because that's to monitor armistice, and armistice is gone. UN command has, there should be a different mechanism to monitor peace treaty. Whether you keep it, you need a new decision whether you keep the UN command or not, but theoretically it will go. About troop withdrawal, North Korea is not very clear on that. So I think, as I said earlier in my remarks, if full denuclearization, FFVD or CVID is directly linked to the end of extended nuclear deterrence, I think this is something that we have to think about, because we don't actually need nuclear extended nuclear deterrence to deal with North Korea's conventional threats, North Korean missiles or artillery. We cannot deal with that with the nuclear weapons. So I see no need. I see no need to give an excuse to North Korea not to denuclearize by insisting on keeping nuclear umbrella under any circumstances. But I don't think the alliance or the troop presence could be on the table as a part of the deal. So I think I answered your question.
Anyone else on that same question?
A couple of points. We throw around a lot of terminology, obviously, when we talk about North Korea and nuclear weapons. We talk about this whole presumption of a security guarantee. And I'm always reminded of what Sam Goldwyn, the famous Hollywood producer, said about written agreements, or actually said about oral agreements. He said, they're not worth the paper they're written on. What is it that North Korea would require that would give North Korea still the most isolated state we can imagine, the kind of assurance that it would enter into agreements, binding agreements, that would forego these capabilities that it has sought to acquire for more than 50 years. What level of confidence? How do they look, for example, about the fact that in democracies, leaders change? Even if, hypothetically, President Trump were to sign an agreement, what assurance would they have that his successor would follow that agreement? Or, for that matter, that President Moon would carry out, President Moon's successor would carry out these agreements. So there's this oddity of expectations that an essentially unreformed totalitarian system would have of democracies. I'm trying to compute this and trying to see how these pieces fit together, and I have a very tough time doing it. The second thing I would do is to remind everyone that in the past, when it appeared as if we might be at breakthrough points in the negotiations with North Korea, they foundered specifically on issues of verification. Let's never forget that what we are talking about is a level of intrusiveness into the DPRK that is almost unimaginable. There has been no meaningful, sustained foreign presence inside North Korea since Chinese forces withdrew from North Korea in October of 1958. That's one of the reasons North Korea has been able to sustain this kind of a system that they have. So we're really talking here about whether or not we can imagine what I will call a normal North Korea. That's the implication of just being a state like any state. And if I think about the degree to which North Korea's logic, its exceptionalism that it puts forward, you know, that would be a very, very big step for Mr. Kim to take, which may get at the question that Leaf raised. So there's a lot of balls in the air, and I think whatever comes up, we need to have a sense that we are not relying on the time-dishonored strategies that have so compounded all the issues here with North Korea now for so long.
Ambassador has a two-finger, and then Bruce.
Yeah. Well, on this security assurance, what my North Korean counterpart Kim Gye-kwan told me in my time in the Six Party talks when I asked him, what do you mean by security assurance? We have, because the U.S. has given security assurance in Geneva Agreed Framework, and in the Six Party talks, September 19 joint statement, there has it has also security assurance that tells that U.S. will not, you know, invade North Korea with conventional or nuclear weapons. So not only with nuclear weapons, but conventional weapons. But what North Korea, according to Kim Gye-kwan, I don't know whether the position has changed or not. What North Korea needs is legally binding security assurance. What that means is something that's ratified by the U.S. Senate. It could be part of the peace treaty or, you know, a protocol that, you know, normalizes relations. Any kind of agreement with the U.S. that is approved by the U.S. Congress, that the successive president cannot just go back to the security assurance. But I think what could be more problematic would be the content of the security assurance. If you look at the security assurance given to Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus in the Budapest Declaration, at the time that these three countries agreed to give up all their nuclear weapons, it also mentions about political independence, territorial integrity, non-interference in their domestic affairs. I don't remember all the clauses, but there is a reference to territorial integrity, political independence, etc. It's more than just an assurance that U.S. will not invade North Korea or will not use force against North Korea of any kind. You know.
So
That could be, I don't know whether U.S. or its allies can accept that kind of notion. That would be, that would be just more than just security assurance. It's far more comprehensive than security assurance and peace treaty.
Bruce,
Yeah,
Dr. Nishida, Scott.
Again, on the moniker of big deal, I don't think it's a good one because it sort of implies too big a deal or outrageously neoconservative, deal. But what is a big deal? It's what North Korea already promised to do many times, and it's what it's required to do by the international community. It doesn't sound unreasonable, at least as an endpoint. On the security guarantees, just to echo some things, it's already been done. We've already given them 20 or more security guarantees. It had no impact on their nuclear program. And oh, by the way, which Korea has attacked the other more often since 1950? Shouldn't they be the ones giving South Korea and the U.S. security guarantees? Because they're the ones who have been attacking us at a tactical and strategic level more often, committing acts of terror, act of war. And on the, is the U.S. thinking of withdrawing troops and stuff? There was concern Trump was, if not as part of a deal with North Korea, as part of the special measures agreement negotiations, might reduce the forces in South Korea. So there's a concern that the president was thinking of it. We hope that's no longer the case or was never the case. But the U.S. is not thinking of that, and that's a matter between Washington and Seoul because it's part of the Mutual Defense Treaty. It's not part of any negotiations. And what I've argued is, even if North Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons, they still have conventional forces. The U.S. forces were here long before North Korea had nuclear weapons. And we didn't attack North Korea when they didn't have nuclear weapons. So what I've argued is that we don't do a peace declaration. We work towards a peace treaty as the six-party talks was, but you would have to have that in conjunction with conventional force reductions, similar to what we had in the Conventional Armed Forces in Europe treaty. On the pressure on the regime, it's sort of like what we were doing against the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, and a big component of it would be information operations. Now, we'd have both the progressive president in South Korea not criticizing North Korean human rights, which is sort of a legitimacy of the regime to control its people, as previous progressive presidents refused to do. You now have President Trump not criticizing North Korea for its human rights and its crimes against humanity. You've got, I believe, the Moon administration preventing the balloons from going north and, other information operations. So along with overt public diplomacy information operations, you also have to have the covert to get information in and out. On the cryptocurrency, that's a really good question. North Korea, people think, because they can't keep the lights on at night, that they can't have a good computer hacking or cyber terrorism capabilities. They are said by the U.S. and South Korean intelligence services to be within the top 5, perhaps top 3 countries in the world with that capability. They've turned to digital bank robbery. It's another way of trying to use illegal activity to get money for the regime and the programs. So it's a thing that we could be addressing through stronger anti-cryptocurrency operations, including sanctions. But the president seems to have said, we may not reduce sanctions, but we're capping sanctions right now. But cryptocurrency operations would be one we'd want to sanction.
Bruce, I want to give Scott and Dr. Nishida an opportunity to comment.
I was just going to address the cryptocurrency, although Bruce has already said it. I mean, if you've got UN Security Council restrictions on bulk cash, it really doesn't amount to much if the North Koreans are going to go out and rob a bank and use the international financial system in order to transfer tens of millions of dollars into their control.
Thank you. Dr. Nishida, any final comments?
Yes. Frankly speaking, if the United States really stick to the big deal approach, I don't think we can find any way to reactivate this process. But my recommendation is that let's test North Korea. So by accepting for example, complete and permanent dismantlement of the Yongbyon facility. So so far, North Korea action taken by North Korea is only a couple of things. First one is suspension of the nuclear and the missile test, and number two, dismantlement of the entrance of Punggye nuclear site, and finally, the only verbal commitment of dismantlement of the Tonchanri facilities. So so far, North Korea quite failed to pass the examination, but I think we may give another opportunity to North Korea by testing North Korea's real intention. So if North Korea really accept our request, so-called the declaration and the inspection, especially the Myeongbong facilities as the first step, then we can give some security guarantees. Yes, we cannot give a regime guarantee to North Korea, but we can give security guarantees.
That's important.
We often use security assurance, but the security assurance usually means military. The words usually implies military aspect, but security guarantees imply not only military aspects, but also includes political and economic aspect. So if we really try to realize denuclearization of North Korea, what kind of security guarantees so we can give to North Korea is really important. And try to make a new equilibrium between the security guarantees and bold steps for denuclearization is really important at this point.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for your time and to our panelists for their excellent conversations. Thank you.